really glad to have Alicia Miller with us. She's the founder and Emergent growth advisor specializing in franchising and private equity. She's also a very recognized expert in the field. She's published over 100 articles and contributed to the Franchise Times, Entrepreneur, and Forbes. Her book, Big Money in Franchising, Scaling Your Enterprise in the Era of Private Equity, is, of course, the first in-depth exploration of private equity's impact on franchising, and definitely a must-read. I leave it to you, Alicia, to share more about the book, about yourself, and just more in detail.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can take you through an overview of the book. It came out in March and has been very well received. And I really appreciate the comments and the feedback I've gotten on it so far. I'm glad it's been valuable for people. So the first thing we talk about in the book is, who is private equity? Who are they? What are they? How are they funded? What does the landscape look like? And what's their scope of influence? Then we talk about what attracts them and turns them off, how they're compensated and why that matters to stakeholders in franchising, what their playbook is when they acquire a business. What do they do to make it grow? I go through the pros and cons of franchises that have taken private capital from outsiders and lessons that have been learned. And then, with so many incentives to get it right, why do sometimes private equity investors fail in franchising? It creates some important lessons for everyone who's considering working with a private capital partner. How founders should prepare to engage with private equity, considerations for franchisees. And then I spend time talking about the future and what trends we're likely to see. Because there's so much to unpack, today we're only really going to talk about the first piece. I want to give you, if you haven't read the book already, give you a sample of what you can find. But there's a lot more material to get through, so you'll have to, I guess, pick up a copy of the book to get through the rest. So a couple of takeaways from the book. It's important for people to understand that private equity may dominate franchising, but they're very selective. Their playbook is also very predictable. And once you understand what they're trying to accomplish and how they're trying to accomplish it, I think it makes it easier for stakeholders across franchising to then think through their own situation and how it might impact them. There are natural alignment points between private equity and franchisee interests, but there are also some fairly predictable pain points for franchisees in particular when private equity enters. So for that reason, franchise stakeholders really need to stay current with private equity and franchising trends because private equity is here to stay. So as I said, we're going to talk through the first part of the book, which is the landscape of private equity, their scope of influence in franchising, and competitive implications. So I think it's important to not take for granted, not everyone knows what private equity is. So let's talk about who they are. Traditional private equity, their goal is to acquire companies and sell them for a profit. Usually their goal is 3 times a multiple of invested capital. That is the money they put into the business. And their timeline is usually 4 to 7 years. So they're pooling money from limited partners who commit capital to a fund. These are public pensions, university endowments, family offices, sometimes wealthy individuals. They pool all that money together, and then they use that to buy companies. The limited partners who commit capital don't have any say in the companies that are acquired. They don't have visibility to what's acquired until after they've already been acquired. And then the general partner who runs the fund is responsible for sourcing those investments, managing them, and then deciding when to sell them. So they're taking a stake in these companies. It could be a majority stake. It could be a minority stake. And then ideally, they grow them over time and exit at some point to return money to themselves and their investors. In the book, I talk about private equity, but realize that they're not a homogeneous group. This impacts their goals, their selection criteria, and their hold period. So we just talked about traditional private equity. There's also private capital that invests in debt. There are family offices. There are wealthy individuals. Some pension funds, for example, may make direct investments in franchising. A good example is British Columbia Pension Fund has made direct investments in large franchise platforms. There are independent sponsors. They're different from a traditional private equity fund because they don't have a dedicated fund to invest out of. They go find a business to invest in, and then they raise the money to go do that. There are hybrid firms that might look like more than one of these categories. There are strategic investors who are not private equity, but I include on this list because they behave a lot like private equity, and they are often staffed with people from either a PE background or investment banking. So it's good for folks to understand how PE thinks, even if it turns out a strategic is the one that's going to be acquiring. And then, of course, some invest in franchisors, some invest in franchisees, and some do both. Those are very different kinds of investments, obviously, and not every private capital firm is willing to do one or the other or both. So remember that franchising has been around for centuries. It was around long before private equity itself was even an industry. So there were a few early entrants in the 1990s, but it was really 3 very high-profile deals led by Bain that put franchising on PE's radar. In the book, I break the generations down in quite a lot of detail to describe what has changed over the years. I break them into kind of 4 generations. The first is the 20s through the 60s, the early years. Those were very fast-growing years for franchising, where founder culture was very important. Generation 2.0, the 60s through the 90s, is really the generation that was prior to private equity coming in. There was a lot of accelerated growth in the number of brands that launched during that period, and that's also a period when a lot of new franchise regulatory attention came onto the franchise sector. Then PE entered in the 90s. And what we're seeing is sort of 2 generations post-PE. The first is the 90s through 2019, right before the pandemic. And now today, post-pandemic, we're seeing new and evolving behaviors from private equity. So I think it's important for people to realize that this has been a really big sea change in franchising, that prior to PE behaved very differently than really what's happening now. Bain, though, is the one I think we can credit for putting franchising on private equity's radar, because combined, these deals were $5 billion, Domino's, Burger King, and Dunkin', and they did so well financially that it really couldn't help but get private equity's attention. In terms of the scope of private equity in franchising, most top brands by system revenue now have some history of private equity support, either at the franchisor level or at the franchisee level, or both. So 700 brands have worked with PE at some level, and no surprise, there's heavy overlap with the top 400 brands as indicated by Franchise Times. Franchise Times looks at system revenue to do that ranking. Entrepreneur, the fastest growing franchises, there's also heavy overlap there. And there's heavy overlap on franchisee satisfaction scores as researched by Franchise Business Review. 400 capital firms, more than, of all types, have invested in franchising. Most, though, are traditional private equity firms. But there's still, depending on who you ask, $2 trillion worth of dry powder, that is money not yet allocated, that needs to be deployed. And there are 5,000 registered private equity firms. There are more than 9,000 known family offices. So there's plenty of money still sloshing around looking for good investment opportunities. And we are not done with new entrants coming into franchising and discovering franchising. I think because of the complexity, it's easier to help people sort of break this down. It's best to put these investors into 3 basic buckets. Emerging brands tend to attract growth investors Scale brands attract both growth and value investors, and turnaround brands attract turnaround specialists. Why are these buckets important? Well, PE has this reputation, which I think is somewhat undeserved, of sort of being swashbuckling risk takers, where they will go in where others fear to tread. That's actually not their profile. They try to avoid risk. They've got a fairly tight time frame to turn money back around to their investors. They don't often have time to take on a turnaround situation. And in fact, in the history of PE investments in franchising, that's really been where PE has gotten burned a couple times, is on taking on a project that was more of a project than they realized. So they tend to be more growth and value investors. Growth investors is sort of a self-explanatory term, where they are really betting that this business is going to grow like crazy during their ownership period. Whereas scale brands, once you get to a certain scale, you are still growing, you are still filling in markets, less traditional locations. You might launch into new markets, such as international. But the growth trajectory starts to change as the brand gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at some point, you start to sell out. That's rare air for sure, but the larger a brand gets, the less it's about growth per se, and more about optimization at scale, or balancing that growth and optimization at scale. And that's what value investors are very good at. So PE has been very selective. They have essentially cherry-picked our sector. If you think about the fact that there's 700 brands with PE history, but there's around 4,000 active franchisors, that means that really they've only touched 20% of the franchise sector in terms of brands. And that means there's a long tail of brands that don't have PE in them and might never have private equity in them. In my consulting practice, what I tell people is that there is a lot of appetite to look in new places for investments where they might not have gone before, to dip down lower, for example, in smaller and smaller firms that they might not have done before. But you still have to come to the table with what private equity values, because they're not going to invest just because there's nothing left to invest in. So that's why there's this sort of long tail that hasn't yet gotten private equity attention. There are, of course, a few attractive holdouts that have just decided they're not going to take private equity money. So that also includes this group, such as Jersey Mike's and Sport Clips, that are quite large now, and have said that they don't want to work with private equity. Both brands grew to scale long before PE really was a factor in franchising. But most of the brands left behind are left behind because they're unproven, they're too small, they're stalled out, or they're unattractive. And, big deals and big firms get all the attention. So, for example, Roark acquired Dunkin' Brands for more than $11 billion. They acquired Subway for more than $9 billion. Blackstone recently had supposedly been talking to Jersey Mike's for an $8 billion acquisition. That hasn't happened yet, but they did acquire Tropical Smoothie Cafe for $2 billion. And KKR acquired the home services multi-brand platform Neighborly for more than $2 billion. I think it's, though, important for people to realize that although there are, of course, big deals in franchising, private equity also invests in much smaller businesses. And this is not just in franchising. This is, private equity generally. They are a critical support mechanism for small business. More than $3 trillion have been invested between 2015 to 2022 in 30,000 US companies. And 40% of those companies have fewer than 50 employees. When you think about it, that's franchising. The small corporate team on a franchise fits squarely within that definition. However, of course, private equity has its limits. It can't go too far down the stack. Most private equity, especially traditional PE sponsors, have a minimum check size. So what ends up happening at the low end is you see two investor types, PE investor types. One is emerging brand specialists. So a good example of this would be Riverside. Riverside has made a very nice business acquiring smaller franchise systems and growing them up over time, but they've got a dedicated micro-cap fund to do that. For many other firms, the checks are simply too small and they can't go there. One way to address that concern is to build a multi-brand platform backed by often a PE firm. So Neighborly would be a good example of this. Neighborly has 30 plus brands under the Neighborly logo. So it can go out and acquire brands too that are accretive to the platform. And some of these multi-brand brand platforms have been very successful at finding good bolt-on opportunities that do a good job of, selling to more consumers and also cross-selling franchises. But beyond private equity, there are other players at the low end of this spectrum. There are revenue share incubators in franchise development firms that take a piece of equity in addition to fees to help these smaller brands. There are independent sponsors who are buying here. Wealthy individuals and angels help at this level. And of course, new PE funds who can't compete necessarily with some of the larger, more established firms in franchising. Often you will see them looking for acquisition opportunities sort of at the low end of the spectrum. The brands that are left behind face more competition. The arrival of private equity, the growth of outsourced franchise sales, and the growth of multi-brand platforms has fundamentally changed, especially franchise recruiting. It makes it much more expensive for firms of all sizes to recruit great franchisees and to stand out, as well as corporate employees. All of these brands, especially emerging brands, get the benefit of support that they otherwise would not have received. Legacy brands are forced to refresh themselves in order to get feedback, get franchisee interest, because now they're competing with brands that might have a fresher concept. There's more competition for sites as all of these brands proliferate. And of course, marketing and lead gen costs go up. So I think that's why it's harder and harder now for these emerging brands to break out because they're facing so much more competition thanks to private equity. So that's an overview of the first section of the book. The rest of the book covers these other topics in the same level of detail. Hopefully it will help people to unpack what private equity has done to franchising, both pros and cons, and therefore strategies for your own business to get the outcomes that you're looking for. There are lots of case studies in the book, lots of math to walk you through how the money is made, how the multiples change, how the value increases or decreases. There are checklists of how to prepare for both franchisors and franchisees. And one of the big takeaways I hope people will get from the book is, look, private equity is here to stay. It's largely been positive influence over franchising, but it does represent change. And the only way to handle change in a meaningful way with your franchisees is to be really transparent and to communicate with them so that you're handling that change well together. When things tend to go sideways is when any ownership team doesn't do a good job of communicating with franchisees and doesn't keep franchisee profitability front and center. So I appreciate your interest in the book. Hopefully it will be useful information for you. And if you have questions, I am happy to take them now.
Thanks for this great session, Alicia. Definitely super insightful, and loved learning more about the book. We've got a couple of questions. I think we can perhaps start with Francis' question. He says, "Hi, Alicia. What inspired you to write Big Money in Franchising? And why do you believe private equity plays such a pivotal role in the franchise sector?"
Sure. So I wrote it because I realized that this information didn't exist. And so I, in some ways, wrote it for myself. This is the book I wish I'd had when I first came into franchising. But it's clear that founders don't necessarily understand what's going on here, and franchisees really are so focused on running their business that they don't realize how much the landscape has changed. And so I felt this information was really useful for people, and unpacking it in this way and making it more transparent would be useful. Too many people, private equity has this veneer of being something that only a few smart finance people can grasp, and it's not true, right? So let's unpack it in an organized way and make it accessible to people so they can hopefully get the outcomes that they're looking for. In terms of why I believe private equity plays a pivotal role, well, the investment levels are huge. When you've got money looking for opportunities, it influences behavior, good and bad. And I think what we've seen on the positive side is private equity has helped professionalize franchising. It has forced more focus on franchisee profitability, because that's the number one thing PE investors want to see is, look, is this a sustainable long-term business that's going to kick off great cash flow? Well, the only way it will be is if your franchisees are happy and making money. So they drill into unit profitability in a way that I think is super healthy for franchising in general. We need lots of focus on that. But it also, they play a pivotal role because people are chasing private equity money and may end up doing things or behaving in a certain way that probably isn't productive, because they think they are going to attract private equity attention when really what they're doing is probably wrong. So an example of that would be an emerging brand who pushes really hard to sell a bunch of units super fast because they think if they get themselves to 100 units sold, they'll attract attention. Well, they're only going to get good attention if, in fact, they get all those units open. So I think that we're going to continue to see private equity's fingerprints all over the franchise industry. And that's why having this information will be helpful for people.
We've got another question by Devin. He says, what concerns should franchises have when their parent company is taken over by a private equity firm?
Devin, that's a great question. There's a whole chapter in the book on this exact topic. I think franchisees have very legitimate reasons for being concerned when private equity takes them over. But I think they should also take heart in some ways, because they wouldn't be getting that investment if the private equity firm didn't see great things to come in the future. So in most cases, your interests and the private equity interest will be fairly well aligned because they want the business to grow. It's not going to grow if franchisees are unhappy. So they're going to invest in things like marketing, support. They're going to build out the team. They're going to refocus on, unit level economics and trying to grow average volume per location in an effort to get the business to grow. There are some changes, though, that franchisees may not like. Change is hard, and some changes are good, and some changes aren't. Where private equity firms can go sideways on this is if they make changes to enrich themselves without thinking about the impact to franchisees and without communicating to franchisees why this change is necessary and how it benefits them. So in order to be prepared, my advice is to establish an independent franchisee association pretty early. Once you get to be around, say, 50 units or so, you probably should have one in place. And it's better to establish it before anything contentious happens, because otherwise corporate sees you're establishing an association and they see it as a legal war chest and like there's a battle to come. No, if you establish it early with the intention of helping to work through change productively together, then you can get some muscle memory around handling change and communicating while everyone is still getting along and things are not contentious. So that practice makes better, is a good thing to establish early.
Thank you. Just moving to the question and answer area, I can see that there's two questions. John asks, can you share examples of where PE investments helped franchises expand more quickly or sustainably? Would love to know your views on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of private equity and franchising, you can watch what happens to these brands. And for any founder or franchisee who's thinking about, working with a brand or becoming part of a brand or working with PE, that track record to me is the most important thing. So look at what happened to other brands that private equity firm invested in. How'd they do? How did franchisees fare? That gives you a lot of information, and the history of what they did to grow those brands will be a signal to how they think about growing a franchise business in general. In the book, I walk through typical PE playbook so that you can see the likely candidates of things they're going to do, good and bad, so that you can think that through. But for an emerging brand, let's talk about a case study. I think that's the easiest way to get through it. Tropical Smoothie Cafe, the first 15 years that it was in existence, grew to about 300 units on its own, which is pretty impressive for franchising, actually. But their average unit volumes were only 500,000 per location. Average, which means there were franchisees doing much less than that. And that's kind of risky in a brick and mortar concept where you've got rent on a fixed location. So they were due for a little bit of a rethink at that point. And they brought in 2 PE firms that were specialists in working with emerging brands, emerging restaurant brands in particular. They invested in menu optimization. They invested in supply chain. They put a national ad fund together and started advertising on TV. They added to the staff. They added support. And all of those things allowed them to both sell more franchises and grow. They grew to 800 locations. But average unit volumes also grew. Those got to be over 800,000. So a much healthier model at that point, thanks to that assistance. At that point, that group exited and another group came in. They were more about optimization at scale and growth at scale. So the next private equity firm that bought them took them to 1,400 units, and AUVs grew to be over $1 million per location. So that's pretty significant growth as well. Excuse me. And they recently traded again to Blackstone. So the business really grew up, and franchisees benefited from all of that extra support, but also a rethink on how to make the business more profitable and worthwhile for franchisees. And I think the proof that it worked is both excuse me, that they continue to sell franchises, but also that 60% of those are actually franchisees coming back to purchase more.
Thanks for sharing that case study. I think just before I move ahead with like other questions, I've dropped Alicia's LinkedIn link in the chat box. So in case you want to connect with her, feel free. We've got the next question from Lucas, but they say, "Hey Alicia, great talk. How do private equity firms typically enhance operational efficiencies within franchised businesses?"
So this is very dependent on the actual franchise business, right? In restaurants, it's about supply chain optimization, menu optimization, and efficiency in both technology and in back of house. There are lots of things. It's possible to be too close to your business, right? So some things you're doing may actually be very expensive and time consuming compared to the margin you're able to get from that activity. Having a fresh set of eyes, fresh analysis on what you're doing can be very effective, and sort of lack of emotional involvement in something can help think it through again from an outsider's perspective, on also looking across the industry of what do other competitors in this space do? What do they do well? What's our differentiation? That's really the biggest value that private equity brings to a business. Now, sometimes they'll argue over data points that can be frustrating for the founder or franchisees, because private equity wants everything quantifiable, everything absolutely knowable. And it can be really difficult for a franchisee to explain why, one store does an extra $20,000 worth of sales on a Friday night compared to another store 2 blocks away. So that kind of thing can be frustrating, but having that data focused emphasis on what everyone's doing every day, on how every activity in the business moves the business forward, can be a good discipline to add. That's why when I went through the book, I provide a lot of feedback on how private equity comes in and changes a business. Many of those ideas can be implemented without bringing them in. So if you're willing to do the work, but put sort of an outside lens on your business and think through what you could be doing differently or better, some of the changes you can make will actually be things you can do yourself without having to bring in PE or sell equity in your business. And if you can, then you should think about doing that, right? So I think it's the discipline and the thought process is what's valuable.
Thank you. Don't think we've got any more questions, but if there's anything else that you'd like to share, Alicia, feel free, or else I'm happy to close this session.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody coming today. Sorry for my coughing fit. I suffer from allergies, and at this time of year, ragweed is my enemy. But I really do appreciate everyone's interest. If there's any questions you have that weren't answered here, you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to shoot me a note anytime. I hope the book is useful, and look forward to your feedback on it after you have a chance to look it over.
Yeah, definitely. A huge thank you to everybody who joined, just asking insightful questions and just enriching our conversation overall. And a huge thanks to you as well, Alicia, for guiding today's conversation and just sharing super insightful insights. But yeah, do give the book a read, do give Alicia a connect. I've shared her LinkedIn in the chat box. And if you aren't a part of our Slack community yet, this is your chance to join us at the Finance Alliance and drop any questions that you might have over there.